What you're seeing on the title slide here, it's slightly misrepresentative of today's video topic, which is the French and Indian War. And this took place between 1754 and 1763. But why is this misrepresentative? Well, this image actually depicts the factions that fought one another in a global conflict called the 7 Years' War. And at the time of the 7 Years' War, large parts of North America were colonies of certain European powers, most prominently Britain and France. The term French and Indian War actually only refers to the conflicts that occurred in North America. So let's take a look at North America before the start of the war. France had a lot of territory in Canada which stretched down from Quebec and into the Great Lakes, and further down into the modern-day United States. And as well as this, France also had a colony at the mouth of the Mississippi River, and this had extended northward to connect with French Canada. These French colonies surrounded the British 13 colonies, and the British 13 colonies were actually a lot more heavily settled than the French ones, so much so that for every French colonist there was about 20 British colonists on the continent. So in total, the British colonists numbered about 1.5 million, and the French colonists only numbered about 75,000. So we come to early 1754. For some years now, British and French colonies have been vying for influence and claim over the Ohio River Valley. The most recent development is the dispatch of 40 men, led by William Trent, to construct a fort in the disputed land. Hearing of this, the French sent 500 soldiers, which were led south from Fort Venango, to challenge the British expedition. And they'd actually already made some progress on building the fort. When the two sides met, the British were forced to back down, since you don't really want 40 men to be fighting 500. You're almost certainly going to lose. The French then purchased all of the building tools once the British had agreed to leave, and continued to build the fort, claiming it for France and naming it Fort Duquesne. Before the withdrawal of the British from the area, though, a dispatch of British men was sent to aid the construction of the fort. And this British aid force was led by a 21-year-old major whose name was George Washington. I mean, blimey, he sounds like he might be famous someday. Washington and his force advanced near to Fort Duquesne, but here that the other British contingent had actually withdrawn. So Washington ambushes a force of about 40 French Canadians at the Battle of Jumonville Glen. The French commander and much of his force were killed, and many others were captured by Washington. But at this point, Washington realizes that he's in a pretty precarious position. There's quite a large fort nearby, and his force could be completely wiped out if the French decided to sortie from their fort. So before the news of the recent skirmish with the French scouting party could reach Fort Duquesne, Washington and his force retreated a few miles and established Fort Necessity. But soon after, Washington was followed by another force, led by the brother of the man who had led the French at the recent Battle of Jumonville Glen. So this was the brother of a man who had just been killed in battle by the British, so probably out for some blood, you'd think. The French attacked Fort Necessity and forced Washington into negotiations, but he actually managed to arrange a withdrawal under arms, which was quite good considering the terrible circumstance that his British contingent found themselves in. At this point, or at least a couple months after this, the governments in Europe had now heard of these military engagements. The British decided that they would send an expeditionary force led by Major General Edward Braddock, as in sailing over from Great Britain to North America. And this plan was leaked to the French before he left, so the French King Louis XV dispatched 6 of his own regiments to aid the French efforts in North America. And the British, when they heard that the French were sending some troops, tried to intercept them. They sent ships to blockade French ports in Europe to prevent the regiments from leaving, but they were a bit too late. And though not formally at war, the British Navy continued to harass French shipping throughout 1755. When General Braddock reached America with his British reinforcements, the first task he set about completing was conquering Fort Duquesne. 1,500 soldiers and militiamen were led towards the fort, but on the way they were ambushed by French soldiers and their local allies, who were hiding in the trees at the side of the road. around 1,000 British were killed, so that's 2/3 of the force, which is very bloody, and even General Braddock himself was killed. 500 of the British troops were only saved by the competence of the two British officers, George Washington and Thomas Gage, and they were able to escape from the battle. Another task that was to be completed was by William Shirley, who was sent to fortify Fort Oswego and then to attack Fort Niagara. But he was pretty inexperienced, and it meant that it took a long time for the fortification of Fort Oswego to happen, and this was done to a worse standard than perhaps an experienced general would have made it. And as Shirley was absent from Fort Oswego and planned his attack on Fort Niagara, the French were actually planning to attack the Fort Oswego. So before this happened, he pulled back and ensured that there were enough garrisons to repel a French attack, but he was unable to complete his objective of attacking Fort Niagara. Sir William Johnson was another British commander. He was tasked with capturing the Fort St. Frederick in New York. And this British force met with a French force at the Battle of Lake George. Both sides lost just under 350 troops, and the battle ended inconclusively. Johnson stopped at Fort William Henry, and the French withdrew to Fort Carillon. Colonel Monckton, who was the last of the British commanders tasked with a large operation in 1755, was sent to take Fort Beausejour in Nova Scotia. Monckton actually captured the fort, and this cut off supplies to the French Fort Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island. And the British governor for Nova Scotia, when he heard of this success, his name was Charles Lawrence, then ordered that all of the French-speaking colonists in the area were to be deported, and thousands were forcibly removed, and there were plenty of atrocities. So this was not a particularly good year for the British, but it doesn't get much better in 1756. The plans for the next year were now drawn up by William Shirley, who had assumed the position of commander of British forces in North America, now that General Braddock was dead. His plans were to capture Niagara, Crown Point, and the elusive Fort Duquesne, as well as an ambitious plan to capture Quebec City, but owing to his previous incompetence, none of the other British command wanted to have him in charge, and he was soon replaced by Lord Loudon as commander of British forces. So, the turn of the year, it's early 1756, and the French are the first people to seize the initiative. They attacked Fort Bull. The French destroyed the fort on the supplies inside, which included about 45,000 pounds of gunpowder, so that hurts quite a lot for the British. British campaigns on Lake Ontario were now almost impossible, and Fort Oswego was endangered as its supply had been cut off. So, it's not surprising that in August 1756 the French attacked Fort Oswego and took it relatively easily. So once again, 1756 definitely did not go the way the British were hoping, and their positions were now much worse than they'd been at the start of the year. Maybe 1757 will be a bit better for them? Absolutely not. Lord Loudon, commander of the British forces in North America, was planning an offensive to take Quebec City, which was still quite an ambitious thing considering the setbacks the British had just suffered. So Loudon left a garrison at Fort William Henry, and then set about organising the offensive. After some delay, Loudon then set sail from Halifax in early August, but his objective had now changed. He was now to take the Louisbourg fort, because the Secretary of State in Britain, William Pitt, had ordered him to do so before taking Quebec City. Unluckily for him, there was a really large French fleet which outnumbered the British fleet waiting for him at Fort Louisbourg, and so the British ships were forced to turn around and dock in New York. And things went from bad to worse. When he returned to New York, he heard that the Fort William Henry, which he had left a garrison in, had been taken. And though the fort had agreed to withdraw, it was attacked by some French allies and a slaughter had ensued. So at the end of 1757, the British looked to be in a much worse position than they had been, at the start of the year at least. But would this be the end where they had to sue for peace? You'll find out next week, so don't forget to subscribe so you will know when the next video comes out, and please do leave a like, and I will see you in the next one.